Welcome, everyone, to episode 9 of our Unlearning and Relearning Water series. This event is co organized by Deltares, South Caucasus Water Academics Network, and the Water Channel. Our today's topic is what Dutch experts do when they travel abroad, and what do they learn from, and what do they make use of those learnings and insights. Please note that this conversation will be recorded and be available in the YouTube platform of the Water Channel. And we also request you to co-develop this conversation together with our speakers with much respect, mutual respect, and empathy. Today, we have 4 speakers with diverse professional representations. Our first 2 speakers are Adriaan Dalveman and Willem van Deursen. Adriaan Dalveman is a historian and a postdoc at Radboud University in Nijmegen. He investigates how the Dutch envision their climate future via their nation's watery past. Adriaan published on engineer Johan van Veen's narration of history, the memory culture around the 1953 North Sea flood, and the uses of water heritage in climate communications. Currently, he is a member of the national and interdisciplinary ADAPT team, which investigates how societies can react resiliently to crisis. Following Adriaan, our second speaker is Willem van Deursen, who is a senior expert in integrated water resources management and the founder of Carthago Consultancy, which is based in Rotterdam, the Netherlands. His work focuses on simulation modeling and the use of model results in policy and decision-making processes. Willem has worked on integrated water management challenges for over 25 years, combining hydrology with livelihood, socioeconomic, and governance issues. While I invite Adriaan, our first speaker, to share his experiences and insights, I request all other participants to introduce yourself in the chat and also share any questions that you have in mind already for our speakers and during their presentation, which our 4 speakers would address towards the end of the conversation. Adriaan, may I welcome you to share your insights?
Thank you for the introduction. I think that those of you who know the name Johan van Veen will immediately think about his most famous accomplishment, the Dutch Delta Works. And maybe also some of you will think about the fact that he, as an engineer, already warned for the flood disaster that would actually turn out to be, that would actually happen, namely the 1953 North Sea flood. However, in the following 8 minutes, I will introduce you to a side of Johan van Veen that you probably do not know yet. And that is Johan van Veen as a history writer. I will center my story around a specific book of his, namely Dredge, Drain, Reclaim, The Art of a Nation. Van Veen started writing it during the Second World War. At the time, he worked at the National Water Management Agency, Rijkswaterstaat, but the German occupiers weren't that interested in investing in water management. So because of that, he had time at his hands and he decided to write the history of Dutch water management. The result was this book that is brimming with nationalistic pride, and that already foreshadowed his later Delta work plans. At the time, however, very few of his fellow compatriots would have read this book. When it was published in 1948, just after the liberation, it was published in English, and the following 4 editions were also published in English. So why not in Dutch? That had everything to do with the audience. The book was funded by the Dutch government and was distributed via Dutch embassies all over the world. And it was also co-funded by companies in the water sector. And it had to appeal to potential clients for Dutch water management expertise. In other words, Van Veen's very nationalistic history book about Dutch history was basically an advertisement. So what was Van Veen's message? The book epitomizes the story I dubbed the territorial water narrative. The engineer begins his story with the Terpenes left their terrace and started to build the first dikes. And he calls this the heroic moment that commences Dutch history. The centuries that follow are characterized by an ongoing war between the Dutch and the water. Despite some disastrous setbacks, the Dutch can conquer more and more territory. They learn to cooperate, they centralized power, and developed better and better technologies. Van Veen draws an upward line through the centuries, one that he envisions will only continue in the future. The Dutch will achieve the peak of what Van Veen called technological civilization. Nowadays, this territorial narrative is deemed at best naive and outdated. Critics see two problems. The first is that it is historically inaccurate. Van Veen proposed a history in which the Dutch had one mission: create dry land and keep the water out. Yet recent water historiography has shown that this was not the only way that people managed water. Water historian Petra van Dam, for instance, has shown that the Dutch farmers in Vlot region had what she called an amphibious culture well into the 19th century. This amphibious culture entailed that people lived on artificial hills, terps, and built flood attics in their houses to which they could flee if the water would rise. If they were not even safe there, they always had a boat at hand to bring cattle and children to safety. In other words, they were prepared. Moreover, locals petitioned against bolder projects and higher dikes for a wide range of reasons. So the idea that the Dutch collectively fought against the water for centuries, critics argue, is at least selective and overstated. Secondly, the territorial narrative does no longer function. The type of high modernist water management Van Veen proposed is now deemed unsustainable. The idea that people can reshape landscapes at their will is no longer en vogue. Current day water management managers contend that we should keep into account ecological values and that we should work with water or live with water. I'm sure that the other speakers will elaborate on this paradigm. For now, I want to point out that it is interesting that the proponents of these ecological approaches also reached the past to make their case, just like Van Veen did. In a study that I recently published in a journal of applied history, I concluded that water management organizations eagerly refer to the amphibious culture of our ancestors to justify expected water management projects. The amphibious culture, some argue, should be rediscovered and we should take inspiration from it. Anyway, these changes in narratives, despite these changes in water narratives, surveys show that the Dutch are still very proud of their historical water management achievements. Not only those in their own country, but also those abroad. In his book, Van Veen highlighted Dutch engineers who exported their craft abroad, such as Cornelis Vermuyden, who drained the English Fenlands in the 17th century, but also Johannes de Rijk, who became a minister of water management in Japan. The self-image of the Dutch as masters of water was sold abroad, but also these international projects in turn reinforced the self-image as well. That was the case in 1948, and that is the case still.
Thank you, Adriaan. With that historical self-image in mind, I would like to invite Willem van Deursen, who perhaps is the flag bearer of that image, if I may say so. Willem, may I request you to share your experiences?
Shanur, thank you very much for this introduction. Adriaan, thank you very much for your very groundbreaking work for my presentation. I'm an expert in integrated water management for 35 years now, and my whole career started as a very solid engineer. That means I have learned how to do the modeling, I learned how to deal with the data, and I think the most important lesson that I learned is how to trust your models. They are telling you what the landscape is that you're looking at. I've been working in South Asia quite a bit, and I travel to Pakistan, Bangladesh, Thailand quite often. Bangladesh is 11 hours flight from Netherlands. And if you enter in Bangladesh, you take the taxi to your hotel and you take the taxi to your office and you're dealing with your PowerPoints. And basically you start to realize that you have not covered any distance. You're still within a very, let's say, dominant professional culture of what's happening. Only if you step out of the office and you step out of your hotel, you start entering into a culture that you don't know, into a culture and into a landscape that is totally different from what you're used to. I call this traveling the last 100 meters. Yeah, the 6,000 miles before I get into Bangladesh didn't mean nothing. I'm still within my professional bubble. I can work there. Only stepping out of that bubble makes me exposed to the challenges we are actually facing. So I learned how to do my modeling. I learned how to trust my models. And then I get into these local communities in Bangladesh and I start talking about my models and I start showing them the graphs and I start showing them the maps that comes out of it. And I start to realize that we are talking two different languages here. The language that I'm talking is an expert language, is coming from the books and it's explaining what we see in models. The language that the audience has is talking about livelihoods. It's talking about how do I get my kid to the school? Will the land be available next year or will it be underwater? What are the crops that I need to plant and what are the risks that I'm running there? So basically, we're talking two different languages. And what I start realizing is that I'm not able to make this last 100 meters there. I'm not talking a language that is understood by the audience we are there. I'm not part of their society. I'm an expert. The interesting thing is that I'm an expert, but I have never experienced a flood. I'm an expert in integrated water management, and I've never seen a flood. I'm talking to people who have experienced floods every year on and on and on again. They listen to me. My voice is louder than their voice, but I'm the expert with book knowledge. They are the experienced with local knowledge. What's happening here? I think what's happening with how we approach all these issues, talking about livelihoods, talking about local communities, talking about being flooded, we are framing everything as water. For the Dutch, water is at the center of the questions of development, of resilience, of all that kind of things. By making water the central issue, we're putting engineers in the driver's seat. And not only we put engineers in the driver's seats, we put Dutch engineers in the driver's seat. Yeah, that would be okay, but it brings a whole set of, let's say, mental models with it that we are now imposing on the situation we are dealing with. The Dutch perspective on deltas, as Adrian is saying, we see deltas as a combination of land and water, and we distinguish between this is land, this is water, and we embank the land, and so it will stay land forever, and the water will stay water forever. Yeah, that's a very inert, stable image of a delta. A delta is dynamic. Everything is changing. Nothing is land, nothing is water. Everything is somewhere in between there. Yeah. We talk about livelihoods and we impose a picture of Dutch livelihoods on a local situation. We are talking about governance and social contracts. We are dealing with a situation in the Netherlands that we trust our government, and our government will be there if disaster strikes. And so that's the whole mental image that we put on a local situation in countries where maybe the government is less trustworthy or maybe the government is absent if we need them. And all these images come with the idea that we as Dutch engineers have about deltas. Yeah. So I think it's time to unlearn what we know about our Dutch delta and about our Dutch system. I think it's time for us to start to learn how to explore situations instead of promoting solutions. It's time for us to start listening again. What's happening in the local situations and what are the local experienced people telling us? Maybe we're not there to provide solutions, but maybe we're there to provide a platform in which local communities and local knowledge can start leading the quest for solutions. I think, to come back to my earlier remark, that's where we need to make this last 100 meters happen. That's where we need to start connecting to the situation out there. I think enough for food for thought and discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Willem. To those of you who may not know, I had the privilege and a great opportunity with a lot of pleasure to walk with that last 100 mile together with Willem in one project that he led. And I also get the privilege and opportunity to learn from his insights and experience time to time, and also share a bit of jokes and laughter. Thank you, Willem. Moving on, I would like to invite the other two speakers for this episode, Alejandra and Danique, to share their brief remarks on the insights of Adriaan and Willem. In the meantime, please share if you have any questions for Willem and Adriaan in the chat.
Should I go first?
Sure.
Yeah. No, thank you both for sharing. It's super insightful. And when we met last week, I was already really in awe of both of you, but also really fortunate to be learning from you. And I think both of your reflections resonated a lot with the experiences that I've had and that I will share on a little bit later on. When I was 20, I interned at a Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and there also you saw that this kind of relationship that the Netherlands had with other countries was often mediated through water, and it was giving advice on water management, and perhaps if you didn't follow a certain advice, that would also influence your diplomatic relationships. So it's also really interesting to see kind of this long history of seeing yourself as the water expert and letting this lead how you relate with others also across international borders. And one question that I have, which I'm curious about, I don't know if we go into answers right now, but I taught these different ways of reacting to the landscape that you outlined, Adriaan. I'm probably butchering it, but either really reshaping the landscape and really trying to manage it and separating it, or the more amphibious culture where you're more adapting with the landscape. I wonder how you see this manifesting in more contemporary responses to, for example, climate change and climate adaptation. So do you see people responding in more amphibious ways, or maybe in more let's build higher dikes ways? So that was something that came up. And also thank you, Willem, for your very personal reflection and taking us really along with you to Bangladesh and to this last 100 miles that can be really difficult to cover. I think I'll touch upon that on my reflection as well. But what really strikes me, and I think you really showed that really well, is that depending on who is the expert, or like depending on the person who's seeing, that informs what is actually being seen. And so who we award that position of expertise ends up informing how we respond to problems, how we create new problems. And I think that's a really important thing to reflect on. So thank you for illustrating that so beautifully. It's your story.
Adriaan, would you like to respond?
Yeah. Yes. Thank you for the question. Your question, you said, are these historical ways of dealing with the environment, can we still see that in climate adaptation now? That's okay. And yes, so what I looked into is how we view the water history of the Netherlands translates into scenarios we make for the future and how these two connect. So how our vision of the past connects to how we envision the future of people living in the Netherlands in 2100, for instance. And I looked, for instance, at the Deltaris scenarios, but also other more cultural products, theater shows, whatever. And I'm building on this idea of water narratives that is introduced by literary scholar Lotte Jensen. And I adjusted her model a bit, and I conclude that there are basically three narratives that tell the story, water narratives that tell the story from the Dutch past to the Dutch future. And the first of that is apocalyptic, the idea that the Netherlands will inevitably drown and that we will become, oh the horror, we will become Germans at one point in the future. And that's the first narrative that has long historical roots. The second narrative is a territorial narrative. I said it is outdated, it's deemed outdated, but it's actually very still alive and kicking, especially in certain areas of Delft, in which you can, there are these plans, for instance, to create an artificial island in front of the western side of the Netherlands to create a storm surge barrier, etc. So these are still very much in the high modernist water management thinking. And these people are this is seen as a continuation of this long tradition that goes back to Vierling and to Lely and all these historical engineers. And then the last narrative is the amphibious narrative that goes back to these old, more amphibious ways of dealing with the water. And yeah, so these are constructs, of course. There are many, if you actually look into future scenarios, you see combinations of those, but I think that they worked for me when I was analyzing all these images of the future. Is that an answer?
Definitely, and really interesting. Thank you for sharing.
Willem, what's your take on the next question?
Yeah, I think there might be another perspective on this whole thing, and that is about control of nature. And I think what the Dutch have learned over the last centuries is that if we don't control nature, nature controls us, and then we are drowned, and then we end up in the apocalyptic structures that Adrian is talking about. But we have become so let's say, enhanced in this whole control structure that for us, there's no way back anymore. We need to control our coastline, our delta, everything needs to be controlled. That is becoming more and more difficult because nature is fighting back, or nature is doing whatever it wants, or how we want to call that. But it means that once you start on this control thing, you need to make things into, it's either land or water, and you cannot deal with the intermediate stages anymore. So we are not adapting to what nature is putting on us, but we are controlling nature on that. And I think once you are on that path, as the Netherlands is, it's very difficult to deviate from that path. And from the moment you start controlling your system, you are bound to control it for the next maybe century, maybe 5 centuries, maybe 50 years. But the whole story of the Netherlands controlling nature, I think, is worth exploring a little bit more, if that makes sense.
All right, thank you. Alejandra, may I invite you to share your quick remark?
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much. Thank you, Danik, for starting the conversation off, and Adrian and Willem, super interesting to learn from you. Yeah, maybe just a couple of quick thoughts of what struck me, maybe starting with Adrian. I find it absolutely fascinating, and I had no idea about this part of history, about what you shared about the Delta Work Plan book and how it was actually translated in English and then funded by Dutch government, and through the embassies, this English version of the book was actually disseminated in the 1940s or late 1940s. So for me, I find this absolutely interesting to think about how this could have been or probably was? I'd love to know, based on your research, kind of one of the first very, let's say, entrepreneurial moments of setting the scene of, okay, the Netherlands, we want to promote our knowledge around water and we want to spread it around the world. And for me, I just see this as a very entrepreneurial act, a way of developing business and trade, another form of trade, perhaps a new form of trade related to water expertise. So I don't know if this is the starting point of that, or we had other moments in the past. I'm curious to know more your thoughts there. And I was also, I thought it was super interesting to learn how, let's say, this war against water, sort of pushing water out and really focusing on infrastructure and engineering solutions was just one of the many ways of dealing with water management, even in the Netherlands, but it became the dominant one. So I wonder why did this become the dominant one? Is it indeed because of the Delta work plan book, etc., or why did the Dutch government decide to fund this way of knowing? And then I think this is also very connected to what Willem was saying, because in fact, Willem, you're also sharing that even today, it's still Dutch engineers that are at the driver's seat. So it's still very much looking at resilience, for instance, how to become resilient through infrastructure and engineering solutions, and not necessarily that's still the dominant way. So I think it's interesting to see what's happening from the 1940s until now. It's still similar. What's the dominant way of dealing with resilience? But what struck me with what you said, William, is that when you were speaking about your experience in Bangladesh, you had a very interesting self-reflection saying, my voice is louder than their voices. And I thought that was very interesting, because when I connect that to my research, looking at the role of international consultants or Dutch consultants working in international cooperation, this is exactly what I found, where foreign consultants usually have more legitimacy and credibility in front of the governments where they're advising. So I thought it was interesting that you said that. So what do you do with that when realizing and reflecting that your voice is louder than their voices? That also can bring some responsibility. So what do you do with that? I'm curious. And then I really like how you finalized your presentation, also reflecting on, it's time to unlearn. Maybe we should move towards exploring versus promoting solutions. It's time to listen. But how? I'd love to know, have you had any experiences actually doing that? And how did you fund these types of activities? Under what structures? How could we do that with the current ways of, let's say, funding international cooperation projects? So those are my thoughts.
Great thoughts. Adriaan and Willem, would you like to share your brief reflections to Alejandro's remarks?
Would you like to go first, Willem?
Yeah, okay. Yeah, how do you deal with the fact that your voice is louder than others' voices? I'm going to say something that I should not say, but you need to be silent more. You need to listen more, and you need to be open for the idea that it's not always the thing that we are promoting that's actually addressing the issues that are at stake here. The other thing that I think is that we are in a very comfortable position because the engineering approach has been very successful. And ever since, let's say, 1940s or something, even before that, we're doing great work. All the irrigation systems that we've been building, all the dams that we've been building, all the embankments, everything is great. But the difficult thing with engineering is that it has a lifespan, and what seemed to be a perfect solution for a problem after 80 years seems to come down to, okay, we have associated challenges that we were not facing so much. So what we thought was an ideal solution. Now we run the world. Now we are the water managers for the next centuries to come. Tend to also have a lifespan, and I think what we are facing is a little bit the okay, if we need to continue our water management practices, we need to rethink if the solutions that we were providing, if they sustain into the future. Let's say it like that. Does that answer your question, or does it give more questions? I need to be silent. That's what I said.
I don't think so, because there are quite a couple of questions for you, Willem, in the chat. Perhaps you can also use that space to interact with our audience. Meanwhile, Adrian, your brief reflection.
Yeah, so there were two questions. The first was Van Veen the first one to actually push, or was it the first time that entrepreneurs were pushing to markets abroad? No, there is a long history of Dutch engineers going abroad and training, for instance, regions in Italy, Poland. There were noblemen all over Europe that asked for Dutch engineers. But at that moment, there wasn't not a nation state like there was later on. So it was not something that was pushed by the nation state as an export product. So it was Dutch engineers were famous, had a reputation as being reliable engineers. So they were taken. They were imported, so to say, but there was not a state pushing it, and I'm not sure whether this was the first time. But yeah, so that's the answer for now. Then the second question was, how could it be that this high modernist, very much focused on control way of dealing with water and managing water, why did it win, so to say, from the amphibious culture? You can throw a lot of ideas to that, from capitalism to enlightenment thinking to modernity, and we can use all these big words, and we probably should. It also there are all reasonable ways to explain this, but I think there is also something beneath that, which maybe is a bit uncomfortable, but we as a species, and I as a historian, I find it hard to talk about human nature or whatever, but we do engage in niche construction. We shape our environment to make it safe for us. That's what we do everywhere in the world. That it's just a question: how far do you take that? But I think that in the discourse now about amphibious culture and looking back to the ancestors and they lived on turfs, I think that what I'm sometimes missing here is that I'm not sure whether these people actually liked living there. There are still people in Denmark and Germany living on turfs. There are on Halligen, for instance. So there are still people also in Europe living like that. But it was also these landscapes were what Yu Fu Tuan called landscapes of fear. People did fear the water. It's not that they were just happy living on their hill and the water would come and, oh no, we just have a boat and it's no, don't worry. There is also an appeal to intervening in the environment and creating at least the feeling of security and certainty. And I think that the resistance that is now against amphibious ways of dealing with water also comes from that. There is a I think that we like this sense of certainty, and there's an appeal to this. Is that, yeah? So it is. I'm still struggling with formulating an answer, but I think there's more to it than just than yeah. That I will keep it here, I think.
Thank you. Although you have already met our two speakers from the next segment of our episode, Alejandro and Dani, I would like to invite my fellow co-organizer and the moderator, Dave van der Meer from the Swan Network, to moderate the next segment. In the meantime, can I request, I see many faces and names, and from your introduction, that many of you most likely have been involved in this Dutch traveling of knowledge and expertise. We are also very much keen to hear from your own experiences. So please use the chat space to share your experiences and insights abroad. Dave, please join us.
Yes, thank you, Shahnor. And then I'd like to give some more introduction for Alejandra and Danique. So starting with you, Alejandra Bouchard-Levin is a PhD candidate associated to Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam and Wageningen University in Research, researching the role of private environmental consultancy firms in shaping water governance globally. Her work examines how Dutch consultancies influence concepts such as resilience and nature-based solutions in Chile and Colombia. She currently works as an environmental and social assessment advisor at the Netherlands Commission for Environmental Assessment and has over 14 years of prior consultancy experience in international cooperation and water sanitation projects. And after Alejandra, we'll hear from Danique Trouwloon. She's a PhD candidate at Utrecht University, a Z-nester and a community organizer. Born and raised on Curaçao, her research focuses on how science and art can contribute to sustainable development on Curaçao and in the wider Caribbean. She's a member of the Six Islands Design and the Islands and Oceans Imaginaries collectives. So first to you, Alejandra.
Thank you so much, Dave. Well, thank you so much for inviting me here. I'm really happy to be part of this conversation. And I will just use these very quick 8 minutes to share a little bit of my learnings and unlearnings from my PhD journey, where I've been exploring the behind the scenes of water governance. And for me, the behind the scenes of water governance has been very much looking at the role of these private consultancy firms and looking at their roles and the different tensions that they face when they are diffusing policies or when they're advising on water governance and moving different types of experiences related to water policies and water governance from one part of the world to another. And I've used very much as a case study looking at one specific large Dutch consultancy firm and how they have been working in the last decade in Latin America, particularly in Chile and Colombia, advising on water governance, advising on resilience on behalf of the Dutch government in a specific water program. But before I get into that, perhaps just a little bit of context that, well, basically the last 4 or 5 decades, we can say that we have been going through an age of privatization. And there is a term called consultocracy that is a bit of a term playing with the word consultancy and bureaucracy, where indeed there has been more and more a retreat from the state, and public policy making has moved from public to more private policy making, meaning that there are more non-state private actors involved in advising in government and public spaces. And basically, this non-state actor that is the subject of my research, private consultancy firms, are very much selling their knowledge for a price. That's the business model. And what is quite interesting and important to reflect on is that there's very much this shift going from appointed and salaried government employees to contracted and billable knowledge actors. And that must have an effect on how we are advising on behalf of government and also the role of government. So this is basically where my research is coming from and where I'm interested to look at large companies such as Arup, ACOM, or perhaps here in the Netherlands, more known a company like Arcadis, that is very much being contracted by clients such as government, such as the state, to advise on issues such as water policies and water governance. And basically, before I started my PhD already about 5 years ago, I was myself working as a consultant in a very classic German private consultancy firm that was solely working on international cooperation projects for clients such as GIZ, World Bank, the UN, or the French Development Agency, and I was working on projects advising on water and sanitation in a couple of Latin American countries and also in the African continent. And those 3 years and of that experience, which is what led me to this PhD. But basically, I myself was struggling a lot thinking about why was I, a young foreign woman with limited contextual knowledge, being sent to advise on water and sanitation in countries that I barely knew of? what did my presence mean when I was sitting at the ministry level and advising on or presenting different planning options for water and sanitation for a county, for a city, etc. And I would wonder what consequences would this have. So that was something that I was reflecting on, and that is very much connected to what I try to explore in my PhD of what roles are private consultancy firms and their consultants taking, and the tensions around that. And maybe just as another personal note, when I was working as a consultant myself within a consultancy firm, I also was noticing the daily pressures of profit maximization, working around short-term project cycles, and frankly, also noticing the stark disparities between how expertise is valued. My daily fee rate as an international consultant was usually higher, sometimes even as a junior or a mid-year, than my fellow national consultants' daily fee rates. So these are things that I really was trying to grapple on and reflect on. And my research very much found lots of connecting points here. So during my PhD, I focused on looking at resilience as a water policy that was very much, and still is, I would say, quite dominant, that we are advising a lot on resilient, coastal resilient cities, etc. And what I tried to do is a very large survey with the top environmental consultancy firms to try to see, well, are these firms all advising on resilience the same way, or is resilience being advised on in different ways? Is resilience understood in a different ways? Are there dominant ways of understanding resilience? And just to give a very short answer of what I found that there were basically 4 different clusters of how consultants from these large consultancy firms were understanding and advising on resilience. And I guess it will be no surprise, connected to what William was also sharing with his experience as a consultant, that the dominant way of advising on resilience was very much looking at resilience as flexible infrastructure and solving resilience with the built environment. And interestingly enough, the 4th perspective or understanding of resilience that consultants were advising on, and was the one where the least of the consultants that I surveyed had this perspective, was looking at resilience through more of a transformability lens, like really looking at resilience through trying to spend time to understand what are the core issues in what we are trying to solve and understand, and looking more at fundamental issues. And it's not necessarily solved with infrastructure or the built environment, but looking more at systemic issues related to social systemic issues or economic systemic issues. So I thought that was quite interesting already, just as a starting point to see, well, how is resilience advised and how there's a dominant way of looking at resilience from the consultancy perspective. And then the other part of my research, which is where I looked at one Dutch consultancy firm and how they were working for a government client, for a Dutch government client, for a water program, and advising in Chile and Colombia, particularly advising on coastal resiliency, coastal protection, the reuse of dredge material, or sustainability in the mining sector to improve water footprint in mining in Chile, for example. And I'd like to share the different roles that I found that consultants from these consultancy firms were taking during these advisory processes, and the different tensions related to these roles. So one of the first roles that I found was more what I suspected, and the classic role, and I think how most consultants at first see their role is that they are more reactors or trusted facilitators. So consultants are hired to implement the needs of their state or government clients. They are reacting to their clients' interest, and their work is very much dictated by predefined terms of references. So that's more of a reactive way of working from consultants. But interesting here, there are some tensions we can already unravel, whether consultants are advising based on neutrality versus being biased. So are they advising being biased to their clients' needs, or are they being really neutral advisors? So this was definitely a tension that I could see and find in my research. But most interestingly enough, and what I was trying to really uncover and explore was more of this a proactive role, like going beyond just what clients were asking of them and having more of an influence in the system. So I did find that consultants are very much shapers of environmental policies. And what I mean by that is that they are shaping policies in the countries they're working in and advising on. They're delivering ideas based on borrowed innovations, based on global practices. So bringing experiences and ideas from other international projects into new contexts, for example. But this also brings tensions of global versus decontextualized practices. So I could find that at times these projects through these consultancy firms can be perpetuating one-size-fits-all solutions that are not always tailored to specific contexts. And in the cases I was looking in Colombia, the main resilience-related policy promoted was building with nature. And building with nature, again, reminds me a lot of course, the Delta Works, etc. Very much a Dutch-branded policy was being very much promoted in the projects I saw, but sometimes were not properly contextualized. And of course, the role that I saw also was consultancy firms being market drivers. These are large for-profit companies with shareholders, and they are part of global networks, markets. They are driving change. They're also setting fashionable trends that could develop also their markets on what to advise on. And here, dilemmas are societal versus market interests. And a big pressure in these consultancy firms are billability, are profit making. And this can cause quite a lot of dilemmas for individual consultants working in these firms. And I can share a little bit more anecdotes later on. And consultants also play the role of being public participation managers, which I thought was very interesting because it means they have roles in manipulating how workshops are designed, who's included, who is excluded, or perhaps sometimes being biased to the beneficiaries or their clients on how to design these workshops. And of course, the consultancy firms are very much, I would say, treaders of complexity, dealing in very complex contexts. Diplomatic skills are also very much required here. They're navigating many interests from different stakeholders, such as clients, communities, local government. So then here there are many dilemmas about being an honest broker or also manipulating the system. And lastly, one of the tensions that I found that I thought was quite interesting to reflect on was also really making a difference and reflecting in these international consultancy projects. You have the international consultants and the local consultants, and really there was quite some dilemmas related to the role and burden that local consultants have versus equitable partnerships in these projects. Once these short-term projects are over, the international consultants leave, but the local consultants are still there and are still in communication with local government and beneficiaries and are held accountable. And this creates quite some burden that was shared with me in the cases that I was looking at. Basically, I wanted to give a very quick overview of these different roles and different tensions. Just to also unpack a little bit the different dynamics in these international cooperation projects. I think these roles and tensions are quite valid for international cooperation projects in general, but okay, this is what I also found specific in the cases I was looking at in Colombia and Chile in Dutch Latin American cooperation. And I think I will just end here because one of the quotes that I got from a workshop that I did 2 years ago in Wageningen, where I brought in the different stakeholders in these projects together, is quite connected to what Willem was saying. When we were thinking about all these tensions and dilemmas and roles, we were thinking about how can we not only be market-driven or not be market-driven, but knowledge and learning-driven. And I think that also was the question that I posed to you, Willem, because I'm also asking myself that question of how can we move towards more knowledge and learning-driven dynamics versus more market-driven in the consultancy and international cooperation space. So that I'll leave it to that. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Alejandra. And then we move on to Danique. The floor is yours.
Thank you. It's really an honor to be here and to hear from all of you and to share the space, but also everyone who's online. I want to give a few positioning remarks, and then I want to share some reflections on helicopter research practices in the Caribbean, and how one might see the impact of past ways of mediating in the landscape, currently in the landscape, but also what current challenges there are, and what roles Dutch knowledge might play in that more currently. So as I already mentioned in the introduction, I'm Danique. I'm born and raised in Curacao. I've lived abroad for the last 13 years. So when I'm speaking about the Caribbean, it's a diaspora perspective that I can bring to the table and not the perspective of someone who lives there or who has lived there recently. And something that I also find important to emphasize when I'm speaking about the Caribbean is that there is no one Caribbean. And so I'm really drawing from my particular Caribbean, my lived experiences, my historic, familiar, socioeconomic positioning. And I also wanted to add to that I'm not an engineer, nor have I ever been an engineer. I have done some work as a consultant, so I am really interested in this in these questions that you touched on, Alejandra. What role can consultants play in this kind of knowledge arena? And what are how does this compare to the roles that academic researchers can play, and what role do others play in this kind of dynamic knowledge landscape? I am a PhD researcher, and the topic of my PhD research has been quite meta, so I'm interested in the societal impact of research. And I have my definition of research in that has been quite broad, but it has focused predominantly on academic research. So in what I'm sharing after this, it might be sometimes when I'm using research more broadly, I might be referring either specifically to academic research or to consulting research. But what we see in the Caribbean is that the knowledge landscape there is quite particular. The Kingdom of the Netherlands comprises 6 Caribbean islands. These are much smaller islands than the Netherlands, so their knowledge landscapes are also much smaller. Their scope for structural funding is also much smaller on the 6 islands than it is in the Netherlands. And so the knowledge landscape looks much differently. It's not as big university or like big universities and hogescholen and big consulting firms like multinationals. But rather 3 of the islands have a university. You have a lot of independent consultants also playing very active knowledge roles, some of which have an academic background, some of which don't. But because of this limited structural funding and maybe the small scale, there's a very high prevalence of helicopter research. And so I wanted to share some reflections on that. Helicopter or parachuting research is one way of referring to this practice of what you were also describing, Alejandra, of people who have no relationships to a particular place, flying into that particular place, conducting research there over a short period of time without necessarily developing relationships to that place or to the people of that place, without necessarily becoming acquainted with the meanings attached to that place. But as you were saying, Willem, being awarded a certain amount of privilege in their knowledge and how the extent to which they can shape the development of this place. And what I've heard very often in my own PhD research on the societal impact of research, as well as in other consulting engagements. And I say consulting ironically here because I think I was working as a consultant at the time, but it was also really intended to consult the community. So also that meaning of the word, really listening, as you were saying, Willem, to what the island communities, what they wanted for their knowledge landscapes, and what role they wanted to play themselves, and what role they wanted different actors to play. This topic of helicoptering was very prominent on all of the different islands, and I think it would be quite easy to say that there is an outright rejection of this these helicoptering practices of people coming in and you never hear back from them, and so you might have spent a whole afternoon sharing your own knowledge, but you don't see any of that knowledge back. I think that's quite legitimate, but it was also a lot more nuanced. I think because these islands are so small and the knowledge landscape like heterogeneous, consisting of so many actors, very often people were quite open to a mix of insider-outsider relationships shaping the knowledge of that place. And so without always privileging the insider knowledge, but then that raised a lot of questions of what is the appropriate role for outsider knowledge. And it might have a lot to do with what you were saying, listening, not presupposing that you have a privileged position or that your expertise is the universal or the absolute one. And I want to park that there because I also wanted to touch on two ways. So like what I learned in my PhD was very much about what's happening right now in terms of academic research practices. But through these experiences, you can also really see this legacy of this history of how knowledge has shaped the landscape on the islands and also how that manifests more currently. So I wanted to touch briefly on the wetlands throughout the Caribbean lagoons, but particularly on Curacao. When you're looking at a landscape, you very often see the colonial history, but it depends on who's looking at that landscape, whether they see that colonial history. And so I've had experiences with research colleagues where we would walk through the place where enslaved ancestors of the enslaved people would arrive. This is the first place that they would arrive on the island. And I had learned of this place as this historical place with a lot of cultural meaning. But during fieldwork expeditions, we would walk through it and drill through the ground and not acknowledge that history, because the main meaning that was attributed to the place was the scientific or environmental meaning. Whereas I've also had experiences where we would walk through lagoons, and when you would look at the environment, you would still be interested in the ecological value and conserving that value, but you could also explicitly see the history of how those landscapes had been transformed, for example, through salt mining, which is a practice that had been banned in the Netherlands, but had been exported throughout the Caribbean, so not just in Curacao, but also Bonaire is a very prominent example of salt mining, also the Venezuelan islands. And when you read scientific literature now and historical literature on how these landscapes were transformed for salt mining during the colonial times, there's this respect for the Dutch engineering and the large adaptations that they've done to the land without considering the large ecological damage that can still be seen. So, for example, the diaries of Spanish colonialists would lament at the way that the Dutch would mine islands that belonged to the Spanish, but they would also commend how well they were at these engineering works and at this kind of manipulation and extraction of the land. And I think these can still be seen in Curacao, and they can still also be measured. So, for example, like the water levels might be lower, or the salt levels might be higher, and moving more to like a more contemporary example. I don't know how many in the audience are familiar with the Greenpeace court case, but I think a few weeks ago now, or like maybe a month ago now, that a really powerful outcome from the Dutch court that ruled that the lack of clear and actionable climate adaptation policy for Bonaire constitutes discrimination, because these policies are available for the European Netherlands and Bonaire is part of the Netherlands. And so the title of this talk is "The Dutch Are Everywhere." Maybe they are also in Bonaire, but they're not necessarily always exercising this knowledge that they claim to have, and it's so prominent in their self-vision and also how other countries look at them. What we see in the Caribbean is that there's almost a neglect or a negligence that takes place, which is rooted in this history of colonization. And I think when there is attention paid to these problems, it's very often happening in this kind of last 100 meters that you are referring to, Willem, where Dutch consultants might be hired to play a role over a very limited period of time, with varying relationships to the place. And inevitably, what you see happening is this privileging of a distance position over the lived experiences on the island. And so, for example, in cases where consultation takes place, and consultation results point to the importance of sociocultural values, consultants might then come in and say, yeah, but well, if you take a step back, really what's important are these other things that perhaps were less important for the community. And the way that these governance structures are organized ultimately allows these consultant voices to be privileged over the lived experiences of climate community, of the local communities. So I wanted to reflect on these like maybe more anecdotal examples of situated very much in the Caribbean, and how this relates to the Dutch being everywhere, and question really what are they doing, where they in places that they are. And maybe to end with a question, I think you also posted a little bit, Alejandra, and to Willem, how do we make sure that consultants listen, even when maybe they themselves do not want to listen?
Thank you so much, Danique. And I would like to I realize we're over time already, but we'll still like to continue the discussion for a bit if you have time. And I'd first like to ask Adriaan and Willem if you have any brief comments to reflect on what Alejandra and Danique just said.
Yeah, if I may start, I was triggered by the word consultancracy used by Alejandra. I think what we're dealing with is water issues are always a struggle for resilience and sustainability, but there's always a power play happening. And what I was reflecting on already is what is the role of the government versus local communities, and how is that power play being played out? Now we bring in the consultancy firms. Does that change the whole power play dynamics that's there? And is that for the better or the worse? And the thing that comes to mind is the water sector, or as any sector, is actually a learning organization. So we do things, we make mistakes, and we learn from our mistakes, and we improve on that. How is that dynamics happening under the increasing role of consultancy? That's my question to Alejandra, sorry about that. Okay. You want me to also ask the question to Danique?
Sure. Yeah, and then we have both of you respond. Yeah.
Okay. Danique, I'm the engineer here, I told you. You are doing the analysis of the helicopter research, and my engineering question is, what would be your first recommendation to how do we make this whole helicopter research more, let's say, rooted in what the demands of local communities are?
Alejandra, would you like to go first?
Sure. I mean, these are very good questions, Willem, and yeah, to give you a brief response here is difficult. But I think, you know, in an ideal situation, and I think this was the very interesting tension and dilemma that I found in my research, was this neutral versus biased dilemma. Because what I really saw in my research is, of course, you know, a consultant is usually hired as an external actor, so should come in with an external perspective, some neutrality versus an issue. But from what I would see, at the end of the day, the consultants are very much hired by their clients. And in these international cooperation settings, it's usually a co-funding system between national government and let's say in the cases I saw in Colombia, with a Dutch water program with public funds from the Netherlands. So I feel there was still a level of bias towards, you know, meeting, you know, implementing the terms of references that were pre-written by the local beneficiary and the Dutch water program. And usually what happens is that when you start a project, you start to see that maybe what was written in the terms of references is not really relevant, and you should adapt and adjust, and you're learning throughout the study or the project experience. But sometimes it's very difficult to change what was pre-written in the terms of references because it's part of a contract. So I think these are very difficult and bureaucratic systems that also consultants struggle in when they're trying to advise that actually there should be, I will give a brief example just to end, which is a classic one and I think is a good food for thought, is that a lot of these projects did value the engagement of local communities and social inclusion in these projects, but usually the budget for social inclusion, the budget to actually do public consultation and workshops and include different representation in these aspects are very minimal. So a lot of times the budget for social inclusion, if we have to say it like that, is actually the minimal in the project. So it's also something to reflect on how these projects are designed. I'll keep it at that for now.
Thank you. Danique?
Thank you for your question, and I also try to be short because it can be as complex as we want to make it. And I think part of the art is in keeping it that complex and not allowing it not to boil it down to kind of silver bullet solutions. And so maybe the most silver bullet solution is that context is important. And maybe I do also trouble this idea of like, who is a helicopter research? Because I also am sitting in my Amsterdam apartment. And when I go there, I'm also coming in for a limited period of time, asking people to speak to me in the window that I have available. Even though I may have also roots to that particular place that I'm studying. And so I think problematizing or nuancing that is really important, and figuring out what works for you and your particular positioning is very important. And I think what I've been trying to make work for me is to, if a helicopter research is a person who does not necessarily have roots in place, to try to build these roots as much as I can, and to try to build these relationships to place and people. And so, rather than developing short projects that are only interesting in a limited period of time that require other parties to do an excessive amount of work for which they will not be remunerated, making it also more extractive, are projects that seem less desirable to me, as opposed to projects that either build on relationships that I've already built, or allow me to build those relationships in a meaningful way over an extended period of time that also allows local partners to shape the project in a way that's meaningful for them. I think more structurally creates space for local demands and local priorities in other research approaches that maybe I would be flying in for 2 weeks and flying out. So I'd say really consider how you're positioned and what would work for you. But what's been working for me is to really try to build this relationship to place and people, even when that physical relationship isn't always there.
What I found extremely interesting about what you're saying is that the helicopter approach is not a binary thing. It's not like you're a helicopter or not, but it seems to be a grayscale. And maybe it's good if you realize where on that grayscale you, as a consultant, you position yourself actually. And
Absolutely. And listening, like you said, I think really creating scope to be a listening ear as opposed to only the one that's disseminating knowledge and expertise is really important.
Can I ask Adriaan to give your thoughts on what the previous speakers have said?
Yeah, so to start with Alejandra, I think that I had a question, but you answered already quite a bit when you in your answers to Willem. So I wanted to ask what the relation was between. So you said that consultants fit their arguments to, or their advice to their clients, but I was wondering whether that also works around whether consultants are picked by authorities because they know that they will give a certain advice, or and I think that there was already said, you relate to that in your previous answer. So maybe I want to ask a slightly different question. Do you think it's possible to make yourself very unpopular among the authorities that are the clients, but very popular among the local community. Is there? Yeah. So can you? Yeah. Is it possible to maximize that confrontation? And if so, how? And then the question for Danique, you talk about the colonial history and how that is still there in the landscape and in the places. And I was wondering, how does that history shape the imagination of the future and the water future, then maybe more specifically of the people in the Caribbean? Can you say something about that?
Alejandra, would you like to go first again?
Yeah, no, thank you for this provocation, for really good questions as well. I think I want to maybe just share a very quick anecdote, because what I saw that was something that was important to distinguish at times too was, one thing is the consultancy firm, the corporation, and the other thing are the individual consultants as well. And they do not always go hand in hand, right? They're definitely, when I would interview the individual consultants, there was a lot of clash between, let's say, higher up management and shareholders of what they want, and they're more distant from the project, so they're focusing more on the numbers, versus the consultants that are going on the field, who are dealing with the local communities, who are working on a specific project. And when I shared this tension and dilemma related to billability, I remember well one consultant in Chile sharing with me the frustration of coming near to the end of a project, and there was hardly any more budget left, and this person was getting a lot of pressure from higher up management to just close the project, finish it. There's no more hours left, and you cannot work out anymore because there's no more ways of funding your time on this project. And this consultant was very committed to the project. So, for example, would find creative solutions to use the budget in creative ways for the project. For example, go on the field an extra time that maybe it was not budgeted for, not in the terms of reference, and not stay in a hotel, stay at a family's house or friend's house. And maybe bill the hour onto another activity, So I just want to share a bit more this, that there's also this rebellious side of the individual consultant also sort of fighting that, what you also mentioned, let's name it, this capitalistic model of profit marginalization to sort of, prioritize the, let's say, more different types of impact beyond monetary impact of a project. So I just wanted to share that. I don't think it totally answers your question, but it's maybe a way of showing how, there are some commitments towards, impact with local communities. So that was just one of a striking anecdote that I found during my time in Chile.
Danique?
Yeah, thank you for your question, Adrian. It's also something that I like to ponder. I don't know if I can give a very straightforward answer, but I'll try. For one of my papers in my PhD, I did a discourse analysis. I was really interested in how people on Curacao specifically looked at the role that they wanted science to play in their sustainable development. And it was a Q methodology, which for those who are familiar with that, people were presented with a set of statements, and they had to organize those statements according to most like they think and least like they think. And they had more space for neutral statements and less space for statements that were they had strong opinions on. And then you can compare how people rate these statements, right? Like, is there a lot of consensus around a particular statement, or does everyone find a particular statement important, or is this a lot of disagreement? And one of the statements was that it's important to understand the colonial history if you want to understand sustainability decision-making and if you want to understand sustainability science. And the results around this statement, I think, are very interesting. So for a large group of the people that I spoke to, this was one of the most important, if not the most important statement. Like, you must absolutely understand the colonial history. It doesn't tell you in what way and how it's formed, but it tells you that this is something we must contend with. I would say that was like maybe 75, 80% of the people that I spoke to. But then for the remaining part, it wasn't a neutral statement. There was a strong rejection of this sentiment. They said, well, here we go again with the same old story about colonialism, and it's actually so much more complex than that. And if we never leave that behind us, how will we? So there's a lot of different narratives around how we must contend with our colonial history if we want to make more sustainable decisions or have science play a particular role in that. And so my main takeaway from that is that it's something that projects or researchers must absolutely contend with, but must not pretend that there is one way of dealing with that colonial history. And so, for example, if you're collaborating with new people, then this is something that I think should be discussed explicitly. Like, how do we, as a group, contend with the colonial history of the island and how that manifests in this project? How do we navigate power dynamics? If there are differences of opinion, how will we navigate that? I don't know if this fully answers your question, but that's a little bit something I can say about it from my own data.
Could I ask Adriaan and Willem for some very brief final comments, and then we'll end the episode because we're way over time. Adriaan?
I found it very interesting. I think that's, yeah, it was very inspiring. Thank you all. Is that a good concluding remark?
Yes, and thank you too, of course. Yeah. Willem?
I can only agree with what Adriaan is saying. I think we only scratched the surface of a very, very interesting discussion, and looking forward to the next episode, I think. Thanks very much for organizing this.
Yes, and I think that's a brilliant way to end it too. Thank you so much to all the speakers. I'm sure we could have gone on for hours, but I think it's a good time to end it. Also, apologies for those who asked questions in the chat. We just don't have time for them anymore. But we hope to see you again at our next episode. So thanks to all our speakers, Adriaan, Alejandra, Willem, Danique. Also, especially to Alejandra, just having given birth to your second-born and still being here with so much energy. That's fantastic. And then we'll keep the chat open for another 10 minutes or so. Also for the speakers to interact with the questions there if you have time. And then with that, I'd like to end it. So thank you all and see you next time.
One question. Do we keep a record of the chat? Because there's quite a few questions that are addressed to me that I didn't have time to answer. So it would be good if we could have an overview of that.
We'll do our best. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Dalve.
Thank you.